I'd like to begin with what's known as a land acknowledgement, an intentional naming of this space in which we live and work, part of a broader effort to decolonize our gathering spaces. Like any of you tuning in from New York City, where Tanenbaum's offices are located, we find ourselves living, working, and connecting on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape Nation. We pay respect to the elders past and present who care for this region. We acknowledge that, like so many, we have the privilege of resources from ceded and unceded land and from the settler colonial system. We'll be dropping a link in the chat so you can identify the Indigenous connection of where you are, noting that it is not only limited to the United States. I'm Reverend Mark Fowler, CEO of the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. Today, I will be interviewing Ramy Youssef, comedian, actor, writer, and director, on his journey in the entertainment industry, the importance of self-representation in the media, and the intersectional identities we hold and need to honor. I'd like you to take a moment and think about some of your favorite movies, TV shows, music from your childhood. Did you view media that you felt fairly and accurately represented you and/or your family's religious or spiritual beliefs? While the workplace is typically the place where people are most likely to interact with someone from a religious tradition other than their own, media representations are often where we are first introduced to these differences. Media is consistently introducing, influencing, and informing our imagination of others and ourselves. Tanenbaum recognizes the power and sometimes the danger media representations have to influence understanding or acceptance of religious diversity. By viewing media representations as cross-cultural communication, the process of creating and sharing meaning among people from different cultural backgrounds, we can understand the importance of ethical representations on screen, better informing interactions off screen. By creating a space for religious and faith-based communities to speak for themselves and their experiences, we learn to see them and ourselves more fully. Because of this, Tanenbaum has partnered with the Walt Disney Company to produce a web platform representing religions, building ethical representations of beliefs. It will be a resource for informing best practices, producing inclusive collaborations, and emphasizing the need for self-representation in religious representations. I'm joined today with someone whose work embodies the potential media has to embrace religious diversity and spark conversations across cultures, Ramy Youssef. He won the 2020 Golden Globe Award on behalf of Ramy in the category of Best Performance by an Actor in a Television Series, Musical, or Comedy. Youssef created, produced, and stars in the hit Hulu show, which is inspired by his own experiences, centering around a first-generation Egyptian-American Muslim on a spiritual journey in his politically divided New Jersey neighborhood. In 2020, the Television Academy nominated Youssef for 2 Emmy Awards in the categories of Outstanding Lead Actor in a Comedy Series and Outstanding Directing for a Comedy Series on behalf of the 2nd season of Ramy. Youssef was also nominated for a Critics' Choice Award and a Writers Guild Award for his 1-hour HBO comedy special, Ramy Youssef, Feelings, produced by A24. Currently, Youssef is working on the 3rd season of Ramy, as well as creating and developing subsequent projects. The first show will star Ramy's series regular Steve Way in a story illustrating the perspective and experience of a disabled person and their family in a real way. Youssef will executive produce both this series and a number of other projects with A24 and his new production company, Cairo Cowboy. His show Ramy is a quiet protest to the one-dimensional Islamophobic Arab stereotypes that have saturated Western media for generations. Though these representations were long critiqued by Arab American and Islamic community organizations, they multiplied post 9/11 and contributed to a 1,600% increase in racially and religiously motivated hate crimes against Muslims, Arab Americans, and any individuals perceived to be Arab. While these stereotypes positioned Arab and American identities fundamentally in opposition, Ramy subverts this dynamic just by simply existing, centering his identity as an Egyptian American Muslim millennial from Jersey. Take a look at the trailer for his hit series, now in its 3rd season, Ramy.
Brother Ramy, so what brings you here?
I want to change, and I heard you can help me.
Speak the straightforward word, brother.
I feel like I have this hole that I've been trying to fill.
Are you praying 5 times a day?
He's jerking off 5 times a day.
I've tried to fill it with sex, but it only makes things worse. I want you to be my teacher. I want to kill my ego.
How do I know I'm not just another one of your desires?
I don't want to have sex with you.
Welcome to the path, brother.
We always talk about being Muslim, right? That means we gotta help other people.
What the fuck's wrong with you?
Your sheikh is really hot.
Discipline, Ramy. It's a muscle.
It's 2020. They don't want a man like me anymore. They want a man like you. A man who feels a little bit like a woman, but is still officially a man.
I know I can be better.
You look at everything as a blessing or a curse, Ramy. The truth is, everything is both. We are forever bound through love, compassion, honesty. I must know, have you showered since you last masturbated?
What? With the...
You must come to Allah clean.
Everything that's good is Muslim.
It's Muslim. It's a soft S, like pussy.
Pussy Muslim.
Yeah,
pussy Muslim.
I think there's other ways to learn this, though.
Good to see you again. I'm here with the incomparable Ramy Youssef in conversation. So I guess the first question that I wanted to ask you is that, you know, your work really seems to exemplify this definition that we have at Tanenbaum of self-representational media, because it's really rooted and it's built upon your lived experiences and a variety of experiences. So religious experiences, cultural experiences, generational experiences, gendered experiences, like we see it all in the show. And so I'm curious as to, like, why is it important for you to communicate these deeply specific experiences through a production lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we really focus on when we're putting together the show is what characters do we want to see and what storylines do we want to revolve around that kind of first and foremost involve like deeply personal questions and deeply personal kind of internal interrogations. You know, everyone kind of has what they're doing, you know, they're ordering a cup of coffee, but while they're doing it, they are questioning the effects of their lineage and how that gets onto their mood and what that means about who they are. And, you know, and you don't see any of that stuff in real life. And I think what's fun about a show is that you get to see all those moments before ordering the cup of coffee. And by the time you get to that cup, you see all that tension and you understand why someone is moving through the world in the way that they do. And so that's our first real priority. It's not really, I don't view it through the lens so much of a ethnic or or religious per se, like specifically like representation, because I think that to the point that you were making, it is kind of like uniquely specific. And I think it's also really important as, you know, as someone who's crafting characters that are Muslim, I have to kind of just think about them as individual characters. I don't really think about representing Muslims or Islam or anything like that, because that would almost be its own kind of odd frame, or it would almost be its own kind of like prejudice, because it's not a monolith. It's not a monolith looking in, and it's not a monolith on the inside. And so everyone kind of does it different, and everyone has a different view. And so, you know, these characters, I kind of made the decision really early on with the show to make sure that these are just the things that interest me personally. These are questions that are on my mind and the minds of the people that I work with and the writers that I work with. And it actually ends there, you know? And then it's like,
Right,
if you
right.
dig those questions and those are your questions, that's awesome. And you're going to kind of see that. And we hope that they're human enough that, you know, it doesn't really matter how you view yourself. You probably asked some of these questions of yourself.
It's interesting because, I mean, I'm really, that's so already blowing my mind a little bit, but we do some work in some of like the exercises and the trainings that we do with corporations. And one of them has to do with identifying for a person, like what's driving them in the moment when there's a conflict in the workplace around religion. And so we don't ask them like, what's driving the group that you're representing? We really are asking people to do that internal work around when religion became an issue in this exchange you had with a colleague or a client or whatever it is, what was running your show? So I love what you're saying about not trying to represent or speak for all Muslims around the world, because no one could do that. And then at the same time, you then end up reinforcing or creating new stereotypes if you were to ever purport that here's what Muslims think, as opposed to here's this moment in this Muslim person's life and this is what they're thinking about.
Yeah, because it's just so varied. I mean, I grew up in North Jersey, and we from North Jersey, you know, something would come up and we'd be like, no, that's not something we do. That's South Jersey Muslims. that's how different it is. That even in Jersey, we're like, nah, that's South Jersey Muslims. That's not North Jersey Muslims. So the idea that you know, we could touch upon something again from the perspective of it being universal in terms of like specific identity or specific practice, you know, we're going to be far off. I think if anything that we can be specific about, that that might be like specific insecurities, you know, that might be specific fears. Those are ones that I think we have a much wider net, because I think those are just really human things. Those are as human as hunger.
That's perfect. So let me then ask you, what were some of the media experiences you had as a young person that inspire your work today?
Well, I think I was really drawn to comedy that was zooming out on society. You know, that's what really drew me. I mean, I remember Carlin records that my uncle would play me way before I was supposed to listen to them, you know, like that uncle that just shows you stuff your parents won't, because, you know, it's your uncle and he doesn't live with you.
That was my uncle was playing Richard Pryor for me. So
I know what I'm saying? It's like, and then it's like parents walk in.
And I shouldn't have been listening.
You know, quick pause because parents walked in and the parents leave, play, you know, and you know, and I remember just really also, I loved Jon Stewart, you know, I loved him because he was just this like really honest, kind of scathing, funny, and Jewish guy who lived in New Jersey that stood up for Muslims in a media news cycle that was eviscerating the image of anyone who's Muslim, like based on fear, you know, like, and I remember that not just around the time of 9/11, I remember that growing up in New York 6-7 years later, where there was midterm elections, and the only thing you could hear about was the Ground Zero mosque. And it's like you're there and it's just like ratcheting up fear. It's like, oh my God, they're building they made it sound like they're building a mosque right by where the Twin Towers, you know, like just it was actually like dominated headlines. And then you pull out Google Maps and you type in mosque in that area and it's like there's 10, you know what I mean? It's like, what are we talking about? Like they've been there for forever. And so, you know, you kind of grow up in this environment where that fear is everywhere, and then there would be people who were saying something about it and who were, you know, kind of pointing at it, and I remember just the shreds of that would feel, yeah, I'd feel really seen, you know, I'd feel really, and my whole family would, you know, really. Colbert would do a great job of just doing it sarcastically, and I always loved the Colbert approach, because it was kind of like he was so funny, because if you kind of were in on the joke, you're like, oh, okay, like this dude's roasting that. But if you weren't in on the joke and it was what you believed, you thought it was just like media for you, you know, which I always thought was just like kind of genius. And then people be like, ah, this guy's like, you know, this guy's a conservative host. He's really good, you know. And I always thought that playing with reality like that was just really fun.
That's great. Well, let me ask you this then, because, you know, your show has received wide acclaim. And how would you say the show, Ramy, and you personally have been received by different audiences? Like, you know, what is it that you hear from the audiences that reach out and say, hey, and then they fill in that blank?
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, I think like we have gone after, in many ways, a wide audience, again, with a lot of the, you know, emotional experiences that we're talking about. But we've also gone for a pretty specific audience. Like there are people who, especially, I think, like with the work you do and even the context of this conversation, right? We, in a way, are talking about audiences that might click and watch that identify as religious. And I do think those audiences have particular sensitivities. And so right now, I would say in the landscape of religion across the board, we're probably, you know, and like if you look at history, it fluctuates in phases of conservatism and phases of kind of puritanical kind of vibes of thinking and viewing things. And we're probably actually at peak conservatism in a way. And so there's been, I think, a really interesting barometer, not even just with how we talk about religion, but this show is also really talks about sex a lot. And so I think from a lot of those communities, it's like we have sex, we portray sex. We don't portray nudity on the show very purposefully, but even the mention of it or anything feels like it starts going into it in a graphic way. There are certain people who I actually think I am trying to reach, but they see a certain scene and they're like, I got to turn this off. I'm not going to watch it. And so I get that feedback of like, why do you got to have all the sex stuff? Or why do you got to this? Why do you got to have that? And then if you're not bothered by that, then I get a lot of really cool feedback of people being like, thank you for showing the human condition in this religious context. And so those audiences, it tends to go one way or the other. Like one is just like, you shouldn't even be depicting any of this. And then the other being like, oh, this is really raw. And like, I actually think this is really important that it's so raw. And I really like that it is because it feels real. And that's kind of, so I think as somebody making something, it's really important to understand the cost of making something is really real, which is like, there's people who are really going to be into it and there's people who just aren't. And you have to be almost beyond okay with that. And so I've learned a lot from the conversations that come from talking to people who do like it and people who don't like it, you know, because it really, it's engaging. And I think it's kind of the point, you know, of like I think someone getting kind of fired up over a show, it then kind of shows, like you were talking about earlier, it's like, if you look at an individual, what was going on internally that led to a conflict, and not liking something viscerally is essentially a conflict. And it's like, oh, well, why? You know, what about it? And then it's like, oh,
Yeah.
that's interesting. And then now the show is like, even like, I always think about like, you know, people who can get fired up about it and don't like it. And if they're going back and forth over something, it's almost like the show did its job anyway, because it's like they are bringing something out. And then it's like, maybe there's a breakthrough on the other end of that.
And I think it's great because, you know, the human experience is not one that's linear per se. It's kind of like we're always in the experience of new information, and what do we think about that information, and what do I do with the old information that's in conflict with this new information. So I love the idea. And I wonder if you could speak then a little bit more about, so then what is the purpose of the show, Rami? What is its purpose for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to put those internal questions on display. And I think that it's to open up those kind of conversations. And I've always felt like the things that we try to cover, because of their deeply personal nature, I would hope that people who feel lonely, or people who feel like they, you know, want to see a certain experience would feel less lonely. And I also feel that it's just about like point blank, you know, just a bunch of weird stuff that does make me laugh. Like there is just an element to the show where I'm like, yeah, this is just funny and weird, and you're not supposed to talk about it, and I want to talk about it because you're not supposed to, because I'm not, you know, a teacher or a politician or a doctor or something. Like, you know, we have the right to be abstract and bizarre, and it's like, you know, why'd you do that? And it's like, I don't know, because we could, and that's fun. And it's like, you know, and I think that there should be an element of that kind of creative chaos in something, because I think that's what kind of gives it the sauce.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so it's interesting then, right? So you're, and I really take the point, and I appreciate the point of not, you know, kind of recognizing you're an artist, you're a creator, writer, director, actor, etc. And so with that, Rami is could be the first self-representational introduction between Muslim communities and non-Muslim audiences, even with that. So I'm curious, how do you just navigate the responsibility of communicating that very internal, personal dialogue and the dialogues of the other characters? Because it's not just Rami's story, right? But there are all of these other characters and the very powerful stories that they're telling around disability and sexism and all of these kinds of things. So how do you hold that and navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's important to zoom out, because for me, it's like the responsibility of holding it only feels like that when I'm framing it as there's this really specific difference between first and only. And I think it's like kind of understanding that
Wow. Wait a minute, I need a minute with that. That's I just need a second with that. The
yeah.
distinction between first and only.
Yeah, it's super
I
important.
love that.
Yeah, it's super important, because I think that I find any gaps that I might leave in my quote unquote responsibility are opportunities. So it's like, I don't need to focus on trying to touch everything. Actually, any shortcomings in what I'm doing create an opportunity for someone else who wants to focus on those. And so I really try and view it as something a lot bigger than whatever we're doing. I really just try and view it as, yeah, this is a beginning in modern America's streaming media for an adult comedy audience. Like when you zoom in that much, yeah, we're the first. But, you know, you zoom out even slightly and think about, you know, global media. And I think a lot of what we're doing now is viewing film and viewing television through what I think is a more global lens. I mean, that's part of my goal too. It's part of why I don't care about what language is being spoken in a scene on our show, is if it's English or if it's Arabic or if it's French, doesn't matter to me, because I'm trying to think of everyone watching it, and also try and take in things from around the world and view them. You know, the way our media is set up right now, it's like everything that comes from anywhere but America, we view it as foreign film or foreign TV, and then, you know, what we make is film and what we make is TV. It's like we only export point of view, and anything we import has this like big yellow sticker on it of like, just so you know, this is other people's thoughts, you know, and like our thoughts are the main thoughts. And I think that that is going to be undone in the next decade or two, where we will be importing point of view, and we will realize that the axis of an experience is not American. The axis of an experience is emotional. And so any of these firsts, I think, they deserve to be celebrated, because the people who write the checks need to feel the celebration in order to make more things that disrupt the status quo that I just kind of laid out. But outside of the value of that celebration that allows there to be more, I almost think the celebration should end there because there's a lot more work to be done, and there's a lot more conversations to be had. And whatever the initial conversation is really just a bit of a door opener. It's not the conversation, it's a conversation. And that's really how I view my responsibility. And that's very freeing, because anytime I view it as the conversation, I probably wouldn't be able to write, and I wouldn't even be able to laugh, because I would feel like I had literal blood on my hands. But when I realized this is just a TV show, this is just stuff that makes me laugh, and you know, I'm going to show it through a lens that, yeah, people haven't seen, yeah, then it feels as fun as it could.
I have this quote by Jean Roche, who said, "Art is the lie that reveals the truth."
That's great.
And so I'm curious, for you, what is your creative work revealed to you about yourself?
Yeah, I think it's like, for me, it's again, you know, it's like we're making, you know, we actually are just finishing up the 3rd season right now. So we've made 30 episodes and it's pretty wild. And as you kind of make these episodes and crack these stories, I kind of start to like realize what is important to me, and like what subject matters really feel worth writing about, feel worth exploring, feel worth acting and editing and building the set for, and all of that. And yeah, I think what it's really opened up for me is just like, even to that quote, the work has really been a great process, and me being honest with myself about so many things in my life, and kind of the more that I've done it, I've felt closer to my family, I felt closer to my friends, I felt more aligned with what it is that I want, and because mainly I felt less afraid. And part of that is in the fear of putting something together, and I kind of watched that idea of worrying about what other people think go away the more that we've done it, which I think is an idea that's really embedded, at least in the culture I grew up with, really specifically, you know, speaking for North Jersey Muslims, but this idea that, you know, what do other people think? What do the people at the mosque think? What do our neighbors think? What does our family back home think? You know, living in the fear of, I didn't realize how embedded that was in everything I did until I sat down to make this show, and I realized how much of it I had to push through to make what I found funny or what I thought could happen, because I used to censor myself. I used to censor my own ideas, really because of what you had just brought up, that idea of responsibility, or that idea, but that responsibility isn't just as a show creator. That responsibility can just come as a son in a family, you know, and the fear of what you think you should be doing can hide the truth of what you want to be doing and what you want to be exploring and how you want to be connecting. And I think this experience has really, yeah, it really showed me, you know, how I was really kind of operating from that fear. And then it has been a really great exercise in pushing through that and past that.
It's what you're saying is so powerful. So a lot of the people who are going to be listening to this conversation work in diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging in major corporations around the world and large not-for-profits, government agencies, educational institutions. Like there's a whole, you know, kind of pantheon of people, but most doing that work in the workplace around how do we create this environment for people to be safe, to be heard, to be respected. That's our work at Tanenbaum, that every employee would know themselves as respected. But the idea of the fears that we have about who we might disappoint or what other people might think, and the barrier that that creates to actual creativity and authentic living. I don't think that we could not punctuate that enough, because that often is because that dynamic that you were talking about was the same for me in Harlem, in the projects, and you know, the projects in the South Bronx where, you know, we lived, and wherever I went, there was this kind of like, what are people going to think if I say or do X? And I think that that lives for people sometimes till the grave. They just don't have the experience of being able to step out of that. So I think that this is a really important lesson for us all to kind of at least consider, like what fears do I have about other people or people's opinions that are preventing me from actually doing what I know to do.
Yeah, it is. It's a really, I think it's a really big universal one. And I think the first thing you said too, you know, about safety, it's like everyone really just wants to feel safe. Like that is a big, it's got to be a top motivator behind almost every action that a human feels compelled to do. It's you know, there is that underlying desire to feel safe, and you know, so people are being creative to feel seen, to feel secure, to then feel safe, or you know, they're in love because there's this connection, and the connection makes them feel safe, and food makes you feel safe. You know, it's like, so these are, it really is kind of like so important, and that fear of being ostracized, or that fear of societal perception can really you know, because that's what we're talking about with media, and that's what we're talking about in a workplace a lot of the times, is perception. That's one of those things that it feels so untangible, you know, how you're perceived. It's like whack-a-mole. You know, it's just like, where is it coming from and where is it going? And it can literally create like this thing I'm doing with my hands in your head. And so it's like, you know, that's nauseating. And so in order to be able to be quiet with that, you really want to be in a position where you can be not so afraid.
We've talked about this a little bit, but, and you mentioned it earlier, the idea of what you hoped in exploring those very particular, very specific experiences, and that kind of providing an opportunity for others to perhaps be seen or to explore their own internal dialogues and questions. And I think that, you know, throughout this process, the audience is able to understand certain cultural context and then relate it to their own without exoticizing the differences. You know, there's a place of, there's a suspension of belief where it's not your experience, but there's enough about it because it's so personal that it becomes universal. So I'm curious, what are the suggestions you have for other storytellers, and I want to use the word storytellers broadly to even include the people who, who will view this session, who are working in diversity and inclusion or human resources or sales, or everything is a story. Like I heard it many years ago, there's 7 stories being retold every day all over the planet. So what would you say, what would your suggestions be for storytellers, both who are creating shows and film and media, but just all of us as storytellers?
Well, I think, again, it's like in sharing something with someone else, whether it be an audience, it really is about wanting to share that thing that you don't think you should share. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to speak to the effectiveness of that tactic in sales, but I will say that it certainly works in television and film. Like that thing you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't press that. It's like, oh no, maybe you should press that button, but like really, like what's the most thoughtful way to press it, and really like zoning in on that in a way where it's delicate. I don't think anything should be said in any form, but I do think anything should be allowed to be said with careful form, considerate form to the weight of what it is, and so whether that be talking about something religious or extremely politically sensitive, I think it's finding a style or finding whatever it is that someone's voice might be in which you can touch it, and because it is something hot, it's just like you don't want to touch it with your bare hands. So it's like, what are you going to do to touch it in a way that feels, again, like you're going towards something that you couldn't do in normal conversation or in normal social convention, but you could do through art, but still, taking that care to thread that line, to walk that tightrope in a way where you can actually connect and not just point at something vulnerable or raw for just the sake of doing it or some sort of visceral reaction or sensationalism. And so those things, though, when you get to them, they end up creating, I think, that really universal connection that you're talking about.
I love what you're saying, because one of the tools that we sometimes use is this construction called respectful competencies for respectful communication. And among them are one of them is this idea of managing behavior and not belief. And I do think that too often the conversation about free speech gets limited to whether the person has the right to say it or not, but with no regard for the impact of when you say it and to whom you say it, and no responsibility for how that might land and the waking sense that it could land a particular kind of way. So let me present this in a way so that it is for understanding as opposed to domination or shock value or anything else. I think that's so important.
Yeah, form is really is very important, and I think it's also important to understand with something really raw why someone might not have had the proper form in saying or doing what they're doing. And I think, again, kind of talking about, if we're talking about Tanenbaum, we're talking about just under the umbrella of religion, there should be deep forgiveness and mercy for people who don't have the right form in saying what they're saying or what they're doing. But, in the position that I'm in, I understand that there's like extra criticism because it's like, I said, hey, I want to hold the microphone. So it's like, okay, like, well, you made your voice louder, so we're going to go a little harder on the form of what it is that you're saying, which is fine. Again, it's kind of like part of the deal. But I do think in interpersonal situations, it's like both it's like my friends and I will say, a situation will come up, and a lot of times we'll say like, it's a case of 100%, 100%, which is like 100%, you should have had better form. 100%, I understand why you didn't, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have had it, so it's like, there are, it's just important to kind of like acknowledge all parts of something.
Yeah. I love that. I love that, because I think that that's one of the things that sometimes gets lost in the discourse, that everybody has a fingerprint on what's going on. So,
Yeah.
you know, let's do our little CSI work. Let's see where the fingerprints are, and everybody can be responsible for their fingerprint,
Mm. Yeah.
whether it's a fingerprint or a whole hand. But everybody gets responsible for what their part was. I love it. So Cairo Cowboy Production Company, you're working on other projects in addition to Rami. You've got a comedy special coming up, spin-off series with your best friend, Steve Way. I would love to hear a little bit more about the goals of the production company, and how you now, you know, I guess maybe even more so now, being in a place of helping to support and guide new storytellers or brother sister storytellers. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there's you know, I think a lot of the main goal is what we were actually talking about a little bit earlier. I might have saved it for this question if I knew. but I, you know, that idea of global media, that idea of point of view coming from different parts of the world and being viewed here in America with as much validity and weight and without any sort of disclaimer, that it is just legitimate point of view that belongs in the conversation. And I think it'll really help in different patterns of thought to kind of put a spotlight on whether it be storytellers who have disabilities or who grew up in different countries, those voices being the ones that are kind of shaping what a project is and what it could be. That, along with the accessibility to film equipment and quality, I think we'll start to see different stories emerge in the next 10, 15 years. And I'm really excited about that. And then obviously in many cases it's happening sooner, but I think in terms of just like global shifts in how we view things and what we're looking at, I feel really excited to be a part of it. And it's something that we're really focusing on. And so I think, yeah, the number one for me though is really like emotional representation, right? It's like really finding characters and stories that feel like they're going at the world's questions in an honest way. And so with that being the number one barometer, you know, we could be following anybody, like, you know, including, you know, a straight white male, you know, like it doesn't matter, you know, there's, you know, because I again, I don't want to get caught up in that too, where it's like, it's just, I think it's important to, when the framework is emotional representation, I think everyone gets seen. And I think it's not about who is what or where they're from. But you get to see all of that without erasing it, you know?
Yeah, that's great. And I think for those who are listening to this interview who may not know or may not be as familiar, that Steve is your best friend off and on screen, and
Yes.
also has been dealing with muscular dystrophy, and having him now have this space, if you will, to shape the media lens through his perspective,
Yeah.
I think is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And I do agree with you that it shapes then the storytelling, because we then are looking at experiences through his unique eyes.
Yes.
Very powerful, very powerful. Well, those were all of the questions that I had. And if there's anything else you'd like to leave with our viewers, I'd give you that space to do that now.
Oh, I appreciate the conversation and just even the lens of the conversation. It's always really thoughtful talking to you, and I really, you know, respect the work that you're all doing, because it again, I think like when speaking about whether it be media or a lot of the work that you guys do in workplaces, I have a very idealistic part of my mind when it comes to trying to put a religious or spiritual lens on things, because I do think that that's where there can be deep understanding and forgiveness, while again not shying away from the depth of whatever it is that's being looked at. That to me, idealistically is what a spiritual lens can bring to a conversation, because it hopefully removes ego and fear. And I think we know that that's, ego and fear have entered the religious conversation and have entered what, maybe we've talked about this at some point. I don't remember, Mark, but like just the what I view as like the industry of religion, and what I view as kind of like, the larger pieces that the world has seen as of late that are pretty, can actually be propelling ego and fear. But I think when we're able to kind of like actually look at it from a spiritual lens that doesn't have those things, and that like you said, isn't about dominance, isn't about power, but is about love, that to me is what's really exciting. And so that's what I, again, in as like circuitous and messed up and funny of ways, that's always kind of where I hope the work that I do points is to love. And so I really appreciate kind of the approach you guys have too, because I think that's where it's also headed, and it's also pointing at. And so yeah, I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much for making this time to chat with us and all of our constituents who will be watching this interview. And we just look forward to continuing to watch your star rise and shine.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that.
You can watch Ramy on Hulu. Season 3 is forthcoming. They just wrapped season 3, so stay tuned. As this conversation highlights, media is a dialogue, an ongoing conversation between its producers, its audiences, and future possibilities for understanding. As an organization inspired by dialogue and incentivized action, Tanenbaum's history is built on courageous conversations centered around building respect for religious difference. We are calling for a continuation of our work by extension of our community to host authentic and intentional conversations themselves, 3,000 or so to be exact, and what that means for them in their real lives and for the people around them. This campaign is an opportunity for all currently within the Tanenbaum community and those new to the community to use our resources to explore how we practically and actually build respect for religious difference. What's required of each of us, and how can we support each other in this endeavor? And you can actually use the viewing of this recording as part of one of our 3,000 conversation series.